By 2000 BCE, humanity had entered a dangerous new chapter. The first great civilizations had already proven that organized societies could achieve monuments, writing, law, and long-distance trade. But they had also revealed a sobering truth. Complex worlds could fall apart just as quickly as they rose. The second millennium BC would be shaped not only by powerful empires, but by waves of collapse, migration, and reinvention. It was an age of kings and conquerors, of chariots and bronze, of written law and spoken prophecy. Across the ancient world, societies were tested by climate stress, warfare, and internal strain. Yet from those pressures emerged a new political system, new beliefs, and new ways of understanding humanity's place in the cosmos. At the start of the second millennium BC, the world was tightly connected by trade routes stretching from the British Isles to the Indus Valley. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was the lifeblood of this interconnected system. Its production required access to distant resources, binding regions together in webs of exchange and diplomacy. Tin from Anatolia and Central Asia, copper from Cyprus, timber from Lebanon, and gold from Nubia moved across deserts and seas, carried by merchants whose journeys linked entire civilizations. Mesopotamia remained a cultural and economic heartland. After the fall of the Akkadian Empire centuries earlier, power had fragmented, but city-states endured. In southern Mesopotamia, Ur rose again under the third dynasty of Ur, creating a centralized bureaucracy that detailed written records documenting labor, rations, and taxation. These clay tablets reveal a world governed not just by kings, but by scribes and administrators who turned writing into an instrument of control. To the west, Egypt entered its Middle Kingdom period, marked by renewed stability after earlier fragmentation. Pharaohs ruled from the Nile Valley with an emphasis on order, justice, and balance, concepts embodied by the principle of Ma'at. Monumental building continued, but with quieter confidence than the Pyramid Age. Literature flourished, producing texts that explored morality, loyalty, and the hardships of ordinary life, suggesting a growing awareness of social responsibility and human vulnerability. One of the defining developments of this era was the formalization of law as a public institution. Around the early 18th century BC, King Hammurabi of Babylon commissioned a legal code that would become one of the most famous documents of the ancient world. Carved into stone and displayed publicly, the Code of Hammurabi laid out hundreds of laws governing trade, family life, property, and violence. While harsh by modern standards, the code reflected a powerful idea that justice was not arbitrary, but structured, recorded, and overseen by the state. This concept of kingship was divinely sanctioned, yet legally bound, spread across the Near East. Rulers presented themselves as protectors of order rather than mere warlords. In Anatolia, the Hittite kings built a centralized state with treaties, archives, and a sophisticated legal tradition. Their capital, Hattusa, was fortified with massive stone walls and gates carved with lions and warriors, projecting power across the plateau. In the Levant, smaller kingdoms navigated the ambitions of larger neighbours. Cities such as Byblos, Ugarit, and Mari thrived as diplomatic hubs, preserving letters that reveal a world of alliances, marriages, betrayals, and constant negotiation. These archives show that international politics, complete with espionage and diplomacy, was already a deeply human enterprise. Technological change reshaped warfare during this millennium. The introduction and widespread adoption of the horse-drawn chariot transformed battlefields across Eurasia. Light, fast, and terrifying, chariots allowed elite warriors to dominate open terrain, making mobility and training as important as raw numbers. Military aristocracies emerged, tying political power to control of horses, weapons, and land. In Egypt, this transformation was driven by invasion. Around the mid-2nd millennium BC, groups known as the Hyksos entered the Nile Delta, bringing new military technologies, including composite bows and chariots. Their rule shocked Egyptian society, but also forced adaptation. When native Egyptian rulers eventually expelled the Hyksos, they emerged stronger, more militarized, and outward-looking. This shift laid the foundation for Egypt's later imperial expansion. Further east, the Kassites took control of Babylon, ruling for centuries with remarkable stability. Often overlooked, their reign preserved Mesopotamian culture, law, and religion during a time when political continuity was rare. Meanwhile, the Hittite emperor expanded aggressively, clashing with both Babylonian successors and Egyptian forces in one of the ancient world's most famous rivalries. Religion during this era reflected a world shaped by uncertainty. Gods were no longer distant forces alone. They were deeply involved in war, kingship, and disaster. In Mesopotamian literature, texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, compiled and refined during this millennium, explored themes of mortality, friendship, and the limits of power. The story's enduring question, how humans face death in a fragile world, resonated deeply in an age of frequent upheaval. In Egypt, religious beliefs grew more inclusive. Ideas of the afterlife, once reserved for kings, expanded to include ordinary people. Coffin texts and funerary practices spread beyond royal tombs, suggesting a democratization of spiritual hope. This shift reflected broader social changes, as individuals sought meaning beyond loyalty to rulers alone. In the Eastern Mediterranean, religious traditions evolved in quieter but more equally significant ways. Oral traditions emphasizing covenant, law, and ethical behavior began to take shape among emerging communities in the Levant, laying foundations that would profoundly influence later history. Despite frequent warfare, trade continued to bind civilizations together. Ships crossed the Mediterranean, carrying copper, wine, olive oil, and luxury goods. In the Aegean, Minoan Crete reached its height, with palace complexes like Knossos serving as centers of administration. Frescoes depicted bull leaping, ships, and vibrant natural scenes, offering a striking contrast to the militarized cultures of the mainland. On mainland Greece, Mycenaean kingdoms rose. Their linear B tablets revealed bureaucratic systems tracking goods, land, and labour. Though often remembered for later legends, these societies were deeply embedded in the Bronze Age world, connected to Egypt and the Near East through commerce and diplomacy. Yet, this interconnectedness carried risks. When one link in the chain failed, the consequences rippled outward. Droughts, earthquakes, internal revolts, and invasions strained systems already stretched thin. By the late 2nd millennium BC, the entire Bronze Age network stood on the brink. Between roughly 1200 and 1000 BC, Many of the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East experienced dramatic collapse. Palaces burned, cities were abandoned, and long-distance trade routes fell silent. The causes remain complex and debated. Climate shifts leading to famine, internal rebellions, technological changes, and waves of migrating or raiding groups, often called the Sea Peoples. The Hittite Empire vanished almost entirely. Mycenaean palaces fell and were never rebuilt. Egyptian records describe desperate battles against foreign invaders, even as the state itself weakened. Writing systems disappeared in some regions, ushering in centuries of relative obscurity. Yet collapse was not the end of civilization. It was a transformation. Smaller, more flexible societies emerged from the ruins. Iron technology began to spread, slowly replacing bronze and reducing dependence on fragile trade networks. New political forms took shape, adapted to a harsher, less centralized world. By 1000 BC, the ancient world looked very different than it had the millennium earlier. Empires had fallen, but ideas had endured. Writing, law, urban planning, and religious traditions survived, carried forward by new cultures ready to build again. The second millennium BC had tested humanity's ability to sustain complexity, and in doing so had prepared the ground for the next great chapters of history. This was an age not just of kings and conquests, but of endurance. Through collapse and renewal, humanity proved that civilization was not a single achievement, but a process, fragile, resilient, and endlessly reborn. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.